Federalist 54, Part 2. We're going to start with paragraph 5. If you remember from the last part of this paper, the issue of slavery and the way it was treated in the Constitution, counting of the enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, this makes it very difficult for Madison to write this paper. As a matter of fact, it's the only one that he takes the persona of a non-Southerner. He acts like he's not even from South, and he quotes a Southerner in length to say this is what a Southerner would look or think about the issue if we did not allow them to count their enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, so that they get as many representatives to the House of Representatives as possible. So I'll start reading this so-called Southerner that Madison quotes. This question may be placed in another light. It is agreed on all sides that numbers are the best scale of wealth and taxation, as they are the only proper scale of representation. Would the convention have been impartial or consistent if they had rejected the slaves from the list of inhabitants when the shares of representation were to be calculated, and inserted them on the lists when the tariff of contributions was to be adjusted? Could it be reasonably expected that the Southern states would concur in a system which considered their slaves in some degree as men when burdens were to be imposed, but refused to consider them in the same light when advantages were to be conferred? Might not some surprise also be expressed that those who reproach the Southern states with the barbarous policy of considering as property a part of their human brethren should themselves contend that the government to which all the states are to be parties ought to consider this unfortunate race more completely to the unnatural light of property than the very laws of which they complain? So he says Northerners are, according to some Southerners, are at fault too. It's a compromise that we reached between the North and South. And in one place, when you want to impose, when the federal government wants to impose direct taxes, you Northerners say that we should count the slaves, this way we can ask for more taxes from you. But when it comes for us to be represented, you tell us no, this in slavery issue is an ugly thing, and you point your finger to us, you point your finger at us. It's kind of, Madison is working really hard to say that this is a compromise, unfortunately, that we had to come up with. There was no way around it. There would have been no way that the Southern states, especially these states right here, where there's a huge population of enslaved people, were going to join the Union if you were not to count their enslaved people for representation purposes. Then in the following paragraph, he says, it may be replied, he's still quoting this so-called Southerner, it may be replied, perhaps, that slaves are not included in the estimate of representatives in any of the states possessing them. They neither vote themselves nor increase the votes of their masters. Upon what principle, then, ought they to be taken into the federal estimate of representation? In rejecting them altogether, the Constitution would in this respect have followed the very laws which have been appealed to as the proper guide. Then again in another paragraph, he again quotes this would-be Southerner. This objection is repelled by a single observation. It is a fundamental principle of the proposed Constitution that as the aggregate number of representatives allotted to the several states is to be determined by a federal rule founded on the aggregate number of inhabitants, so the right of choosing this allotted number in each state is to be exercised by such part of the inhabitants as the state itself may designate. The qualifications on which the right of suffrage depend are not, perhaps, the same in any two states. In some of the states, the difference is very material. In every state, a certain proportion of inhabitants are deprived of this right by the constitution of the state, who will be included in the census by which the federal constitution apportions the representatives. He's reminding the readers that back then, different states had different qualifications that they would need people to have to run for office, whether to run for the Senate of every state or the lower house of every state, and also lots of qualifications about who could vote. So he's reminding the readers, he says, look, in all the states, the qualifications are different. Some states might want people to have at least 50 acres of land, 25 acres of land, or this much money. In some other states, it's not like that. So he says, it reminds them that there's a lot of differences in the states, and to have made a compromise, to have written this Constitution, we had to make this compromise. In this point of view, the southern states might retort the complaint by insisting that the principle laid down by the convention required that no regard should be had to the policy of particular states towards their own inhabitants, and consequently that the slaves as inhabitants should have been admitted into the census according to their full number in like manner with other inhabitants who, by the policy of other states, are not admitted to all the rights of citizens. A rigorous adherence, however, to this principle is waived by those who would be gainers by it. All that they ask is that equal moderation be shown on the either side. Let the case of the slaves be considered as it is in truth a peculiar one. Let the compromising expedient of the Constitution be mutually adopted, which regards them as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man. So here he's at pains to explain this, but he said we had to make a compromise. One of the things that I want you to do, I encourage you to do, is to look at this mini-series by PBS called Eyes on the Prize. It is excellent. You'll see that many brave people in the 1900s, but leading into 1940s and 50s and 60s, did so much for the issue of civil rights in the United States. I know Dr. Martin Luther King gets a lot of credit. However, there's lots of other people that need to be given credit to. And another thing that I recommend for you to do is to, if you can, read the books or listen to the talks by Taylor Branch. He did a 3-volume series called America in the King Years. It covers 20 years. It's beautifully written. He's a great storyteller. So he tells you all the things that were going on for America to live up to its promise and allow all its citizens to start taking part in it. So I think in that dark chapter of slavery, even though we had the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, but it took another 100 years, lots of struggle for America to get where it is. So make sure there's lots of the Taylor Branches talks on C-SPAN, on YouTube. On C-SPAN, every time one of his books came out, he talked about it, as well as on YouTube. So make sure you watch it and just see how the South of the United States, all these southern states right here, changed because they started desegregation, how it was in the past. So this will give you a better view, actual history of the United States. I'll give you some live footage of how some of the Southerners, how ugly they could act towards African Americans. So we all have long ways to go. But remember, as you're reading Federalist 54 or any time issue of slavery is talked about, it's just something that unfortunately by the time those people sat down to write the Constitution, it was so entrenched into the social fabric of America, especially the South, that they just couldn't do anything with it. Unfortunately, at that time, they didn't have the moral courage, majority of them, to address it a little better. But I say this, having said elsewhere that if I were there, if I were at the time, if I were them, I might have dealt with it the same way. So we always have to remember that we are human beings and put ourselves in people's situations, see if we had the same upbringing, the same culture around us for a number of years, the way things were 2 centuries ago, would we or would we not act differently?